All right, we're going to start up again. And I will turn to Parliamentarian Johnson so that we may reestablish a quorum.
Okay. I will begin with a roll call with Madam Chair.
Present.
Vice Chair Brown? Present. Vice Chair Brown is present. Madam Chair is present. Excuse me, Member Bradford? Here. Member Bradford is present. Member Grills? Present. Member Grills is present. Member Holder? Here. Member Holder is present. Member Jones Sawyer? Present. Member Jones Sawyer is present. Member Lewis? Present. Excuse me. Member Lewis is present. Member Montgomery Stepp? Here. Member Montgomery Stepp is present. And Member Tamaki? Here. Member Tamaki is present. Madam Chair, there are 9 members on the task force. You need 5 to establish a quorum. The present number, the number present today is 9, and a quorum has been established.
Thank you, Parliamentarian Johnson. Now we'll turn to the next, or resume the item on the agenda, which is 22, discussion and action item, Advisory Committee's final recommendations on potential remedies, remedial programs, laws, and apologies for atrocities in the interim report, part 2. Presenters, all task force members.
Okay, so we're picking up here at number 6, which you can see on display, separate and unequal education. The members of this advisory committee were members Tamaki and Vice Chair Brown, Vice Chair Dr. Brown. There are a couple of new proposals and substantive changes for this chapter. Member Tamaki, do you want to introduce those, or do you want me?
Yeah, I can talk about the changes. I just want to commend the Department of Justice staff for doing really excellent work in putting these recommendations together. They're comprehensive. They're well footnoted to expert authorities and studies that have been done, and I think they're impressive. So just focusing, the contents are just summarized in those bullet points, but just focusing on changes. And I'll just kind of run through them very quickly. One is to continue reducing racial disparities in the STEM field, science, technology, engineering, medicine, for African American students. And there's a report from the Education Trust and the Kaport Center report that lists 15 proposals to increase enrollment and create more equitable enrollment practices, eliminate barriers, et cetera. And that's certainly worth, I think, focusing on and for the legislature to look at. On K through 12 curriculum reforms, the proposal was added to require the Black Studies Fund, which is described in the proposal, the recommendations, as an entity within the California Department of Education to review curriculum, and specifically teaching of history and identity and things that are really crucial given what everybody has presented and talked about and the purpose of the task force. And among the recommendations is to incorporate the curriculum of the Freedom Schools of Mississippi Summer Project. And that was a groundbreaking historical event during the intense period of civil rights, voter registration, marches to desegregate in the South. And a part of that was students and scholars began to teach summer projects. And much of it was standard curriculum, reading, writing, arithmetic kind of thing, but couched in history, civic engagement, Black history, movement, organizing, and found as a teaching methodology, it was very effective. And so that's reiterated here. And then taking that further, Freedom School summer demonstration pilot projects, which I understand have been rolled out in a number of different places across the country, and it's meant to augment, the regular school year, but it goes into both the academics, but also character building, leadership building, civic engagement, intergenerational servant leadership, which I understand is values to strive to serve others rather than serving yourself, and basically to solidify the sense of community as part of that curriculum. The next area that's new is expanding access to career technical education for descendants, so that the career technical education covers typically 15 different areas, and it's intended to create pathways for students to get into certain careers, whereas now, Black students are steered into professions or not steered at all. And this one, the CTE program is designed to provide for mentors, guidance, a path forward into technology, healthcare, construction, internships, college offerings. This might be in work, green technology, but with a goal toward the end of having a certificate and a skill or training in certain areas. And these programs are offered in colleges and junior colleges, community colleges, but also I think that the pathway actually begins in K through 12, at least to create that interest. And it also includes work readiness training. That's things like how to do a resume, and providing, I think very importantly, mentor input. And some of these, I listed some of them, but I think it's worth talking about more what these areas are. So agricultural studies, arts and media, building and construction, energy, engineering, fashion, health, and science, and so on. In terms of the chapter is written, talks about increasing Black enrollment in the medical professions, increasing the pipeline for that. And I was talking to Aisha about, and I'm sure we've taken a look at this, shining a light a bit, maybe in the report on Drew Medical in Los Angeles, which has had success in recruiting into the medical profession and targeting the African American community. There's another one going back to K through 12 on segregation, enabling students, like for instance in Berkeley, there's a process voluntarily where students can transfer to other schools within the district or outside of the district. There's a list of criteria that are met, but that program really needs funding for the public transportation part. And so we made some tweaks to that particular section that covers some of the basics, like if you want to go to another school in the district, how you get there, which is crucial to parents. I think I'll stop here. Yeah.
Member Tamaki, thank you for that. And I found this chapter very comprehensive and really well thought out. I actually do have perhaps the most trouble with the last section, which is section M on reducing K through 12 public school segregation. It's tricky, because effectively we understand how public schools work. Through funding. We know that a lot of public school funding happens through private PTA parent engagement. And so the idea of, I'm going to tell you a story about my son. who is a Berkeley Unified School District elementary schooler. And he goes to one of the first schools in Berkeley to integrate. And so he was in first grade, and that occurred during the COVID-19 lockdown, and so it happened over Zoom. And so I could hear him in his first grade class, and his teacher was, really celebrating the history of integration, at his elementary school, and ended the lesson with, and that's why at this school we no longer have segregation. And my child, who probably should be on the task force, said, but Mr., teacher's name, isn't there still segregation with money, right? And the teacher said, yeah, you're right, and then and moved on. And so I think we have to, I think in a way, shuffling around, black children in a district, out of a district, doesn't actually solve the issues at all. In fact, they exacerbate them because they typically end up becoming, further minoritized into the schools that they end up in. And also, you end up, not actually solving the structural issue, which is the poor funding of the schools that they actually have in their own neighborhoods. And so I understand that, what I'm suggesting kind of goes against the long tradition of integration, and we know that integration is large. It was it's almost explicitly facilitated in this country through schooling. But what I think the recommendation would lead to is, schools in black neighborhoods, which, if they are poor schools in black neighborhoods, actually continuing to suffer from poverty. Going back to the Berkeley model, so Berkeley also has a significant issue with the middle school system. So Berkeley has 3 middle schools: Longfellow, Willard, and King. So Willard and King are the higher performing schools in Berkeley. And Longfellow has long been seen as the poorest performing schools with the highest rates of suspension. Now, what's interesting about Longfellow is that Longfellow has been the school that if you were a inter-district transfer, say you wanted to go to a Berkeley public school from Oakland, where you would be sent is Longfellow. Right? So they're not going to send you to King, they're not going to send you to Willard. They send you to Longfellow. And so you're seeing that Longfellow is the one middle school in Berkeley with the lowest performance rates, right, with the highest suspension rates. And so what Berkeley has decided to do, following this model that they have, especially at the elementary school level, is they've decided to shuffle around people again in the middle schools by creating a rezoned approach that would basically bring more students from Willard and King into Longfellow. Effectively, to just speak plainly, rich white children from King and Willard into Longfellow. Well, one can imagine what the public town hall was, around that plan. Berkeley passed it, and now they're experimenting with this. But I think even with that, and we have to, I want to applaud the efforts. We have to think about the principle of integration and segregation by thinking about, I think, the holistic, economic situations which they are simply symptoms of. You don't have black students in certain schools, right? Because parents cannot afford to live in the neighborhoods where those schools exist. So we understand that we are trying to produce some policies around housing discrimination and incentives for housing that could help that. But I want us to just think about this, right? Because, in Section M, there's just simply integration as a virtue, as the driving force of it, and it isn't actually, we shouldn't simply assume that integration means equality, right? And that is, I know, a difficult point to say and a difficult point to accept, but we know that is very true. And I want to say, on the record for myself, there's nothing wrong with, a majority black school in a majority black neighborhood. There is something wrong with not funding majority black schools in majority black neighborhoods. It is very fine for black communities to want to be black communities. It is very important that a black child can know that he lives in a community where his friends also go to school, where his teachers live, In fact, we understand, Dr. Brown, you talked about the kind of economic accomplishments a century ago, and the reason for those economic accomplishments because, black people live together, work together, right? And there was circulation of economic opportunity, but as well as, socialization. To live in a neighborhood with your teacher is a tremendous opportunity, right? To live in a neighborhood where your school is a central node of your neighborhood is a tremendous opportunity. And it's an opportunity that we have to recognize that mostly white students in their neighborhoods are able to afford. And I think this recommendation actually deprives black students of that same opportunity.
Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized.
Madam Chair, members of the task force, Dr. John, you really touched on a sensitive nerve for me. But right now, would you all believe that there are 5 middle schools in San Francisco? Middle schools where blacks are in the minority. And in those schools, there is that persistent problem of violence, fights, walking up and down the halls, not in the class. In some instances, there's not been the kind of rebuilding community. And that has caused parents to not have a feeling of belonging to the school. So what's the solution? If you don't have intentional wraparound services in every one of those schools where these black students are a minuscule minority, you're setting up, again, our people for hurt and for harm. So that, Brother Tamaki, if we're going to push for integration, which is an ideal dream, we're going to have to make some allowances and nuances to make sure that it is mandatory that in every one of these schools, black children receive quality, wraparound services. And that includes mentoring and tutoring and health services for mental health and physical health. Can we not include that?
Member Tamaki, you're recognized.
So first of all, thanks, Professor Lewis, for noting that and also telling it through your own personal experience. I guess the challenge here is how you want to treat this section, and whether the principle of, I mean, it's easy to basically come to the conclusion that because we have a situation where schools and communities are not only segregated, but they are hyper segregated. And as a result, as a attendant factor to that hyper segregation is underfunding, underserved communities, and the education proposal includes a fairly big section on additional funding to go to those schools. So point well taken. And let's fund those schools, which is ultimately what your son, identified. And he's going to be just like you, man. But the question is the issue of integration and voluntary integration, allowing that. So I just want to be clear. Are you saying as a principle that should not be in our recommendations and it's not worth pursuing? Should we leave it out, or should we modify it in some way that paints a bigger picture? And then if we include it, I presume that we would add Pastor Brown's suggestion that, you know, when this is done, and bear in mind, this is voluntary, this is not forced busing that happened in the 60s and 70s, in which Member Grill's experience in Boston with having rocks thrown at the buses. But voluntary, the services, whether it's mental health or mentorship or whatever, could be part of the recommendation as part of that integration model. But fundamentally, is just a matter of, you know, a gating thing. Are we taking a position on integration in principle?
Right. I mean, and that's why I said it was a difficult, you know, and thank you for the response, Member Tamaki, and thank you, Dr. Brown, for, you know, for bringing us to San Francisco and sharing that experience and your suggestions there as well. And I think absolutely where, you know, Black students are the minority in their current schools, there does need to be increased support. There needs to be a series of I think, I don't want to say programs, but there needs to be, you know, a series of approaches that help to support those students, because, you know, operating, you know, as a minority in an educational environment is a daunting experience. Because especially as a teacher, you're teaching to the majority. As a professor, you're teaching to the majority. You're trying to, you know, make sure that your lessons are understood by the largest swath of people in your classroom. And then so when you're the only Black kid in that classroom, that lesson is not for you, literally. And so I think, you know, Member Tamaki, what I'm saying is that we have to focus on funding, you know, these schools, right? I think the question of, I think what I have is a question here to respond to your question, which is, what does this integrationist program actually accomplish? Like, what's the motivation of it? So my understanding is that it's meant to put, you know, Black students, right, in better funded schools. Right? And we're using integration as a shorthand for talking about basically bringing poor students into wealthier or better funded schools. And so if the objective is getting these students to better funded schools, then we should provide them with better funded schools in their neighborhoods. I think if we use an integrationist framework, right, again, it's a sleight of hand. Right? It is, let's not actually talk about the fact that we are not funding schools in Black neighborhoods. We are not funding schools adequately in poor neighborhoods. It's also getting us away from the fact that a wealthy school has extracurriculars and has all of these things because they're funded by wealthy parents, right? Who can afford to spend the extra $250 a term for their student to, you know, take chess or do whatever, right? So I think, you know, when I read section M, it is about, I understand the principle of integration because integration is meant to respond to the so-called harm of segregation. But what segregation is, as my child said, segregation of money, right? It is unequal access and unequal support. And so I think in principle, what you have is if a neighborhood school in a Black community was adequately funded, there would actually be no driving incentive for a parent to want to send their child to another school in another district by some mechanism by which they can't walk their child to school. They got to put their child on a school bus at 6 o'clock in the morning and hope they get there, right? And I think, you know, at the end of the day, the bottom line is just funding these schools.
I have a question that's related to Vice Chair Brown and Member Tamaki. May or may not be related. In the preliminary recommendations for the separate and unequal education chapter in the report, there is a recommendation to provide funding for African American or American Freedmen owned and controlled K through 12 schools, colleges, universities, trade and professional schools. But I don't see it on this list. so I don't know, like, did you all talk about that in the advisory committee? Because for instance, like the first, expert witness that we heard, actually the DOJ invited them, Professor Roy Brooks, in, what was it, like September 2021, like he talked about the idea of, for instance, like boarding schools, like for African Americans. And a lot of people laughed it off, but I know we saw him again when we both, me and Member Tamaki, spoke at Santa Clara Law School a few months ago, and he emphatically kind of, said, he supports this idea of like reparations in the form of education, of like African American owned and controlled schools, or funding, particularly for African American students in African American neighborhoods. So it's kind of similar to, I think, what you're raising. So I was just wondering, like, in your deliberations, I don't know, like, what is your idea about that point in the preliminary recommendations in the interim report around providing funding for African American, American Freedmen owned and controlled K through 12 schools, colleges, and universities, trade and professional schools?
As I sit here right now, I do not recall specifically that. What I do recall is additional funding to underfunded schools in highly segregated areas. There's mentioning of formerly redlined communities. I think that was part of the text, and so on. But I may be missing that. If
It's in the executive summary on page 20.
okay,
Yeah.
Madam
go
Chair,
ahead. Sorry.
let me push further my comments earlier. Again, I go back to the wraparound services. All of you saw Hakeem Jeffries give that masterful speech. But if you really get to know his journey, he came to that point of being that great mind and that terrific orator. Because number one, he sat at the feet of one Sandy Ray and Harry Wright at the Cornerstone Baptist Church in Brooklyn, New York. And number two, when he went to Binghamton, to college, where very much black folks were in the minority, he ran into some cattle. And that's where he got his wraparound services. And the only way we're going to make integration really work, these students K through 12 must have their place of meeting in that school and receive the wraparound services where they will get intentional assistance. I don't think that's asking for too much. And we will be able to deal with what Mr. Tamaki is raising the question about integration. But they must have the support in spite of services. That's the only way we've been able to make it.
My argument, though, is if it's in the interim report as a preliminary recommendation to provide direct funding for the creation of schools that cater to the African American community, like what is the rationale for it then not to be included as a final recommendation? Like what has changed from?
I think we missed it.
Oh,
I think that's this plain answer, and I'm sorry that we didn't address it. I think if it's in the interim report, we have to take that seriously and take a look at that. So I would ask, I don't know, I can't speak for Pastor Brown, you should chime in, but I think we should work with the DOJ and see how we might translate that into the recommendation.
I can briefly respond to that.
Yeah, please.
Just a couple of things. This discussion that you've all been having ties into a couple of different recommendations that are in and may not have been translated in exactly the wording, and part of that goes to the recommendation on Proposition 209, which is an issue with regard to the specificity with which you're raising this point, and that is something that we've developed in our further research following the preliminary recommendations, which certainly express the sense of the task force about, you know, where the task force wants to go, and our job now is sort of translating that into these concrete proposals for action. So the wraparound services, critical component, that is worked into our recommendation on mental health in schools and the health chapter, and I think it's a super incredibly important thing that definitely is one of the things that we've worked through. We do have increased funding to schools. It's A on what you're looking at on the screen right now with regard to the local control funding formula, and that will go to some extent to this issue of equity in allocation of funding. I think there's a lot of work to be done on that law that we've talked about in these proposed recommendations that kind of goes along in the direction you're talking about. And then again, like I said, on those specific recommendations that were in the preliminary recommendations, a lot of them have been sort of diffused into a lot of the more specific recommendations that are being made on education, health, infrastructure and transportation and those things. So what we can do, Chair Moore, is if you have a specific question or anything you want to think about, if you want to send that to us, or this goes for anybody, obviously, by February 8th, as I've mentioned, send us your questions, and we can also help sort of back end elucidate exactly how different things are taken care of by all the different advisory committees. And I think that'll hopefully help tie all the loose ends together.
Chair Moore, may I just add, so I think we have to address your point, and I trust that we'll work with the DOJ team to do that. On the other point, I'm just seeking clarification from Jovan and the task force as to whether there's a philosophical disagreement over integration. I think there is agreement, frankly. I'm just guessing on the task force level that the wording can't be that integration is the problem solver here. And we don't want any impression that sleight of hand or kind of not focusing on the principal issue. So in terms of the local funding formulas and the additional money to be poured into that should go into underfunded districts or underfunded schools, that's clear, and that could be, for instance, reframed to be the real problem is disparate funding to the schools, and we're not proposing that integrated schools are a superior model than majority black schools, for instance. If that is the direction, then it basically says that the underfunding of the schools is the problem. Integration doesn't solve that, but it still has a value in and of itself, and if to the extent that that is a pathway forward for those parents and school districts that voluntarily do it, then we should have wraparound services. On the other hand, if our position is no, we're not going to support integration, as it should not find its way into any of our recommendations, then that's different. And so I'm not arguing about the point, I'm just kind of seeking clarity as to what you think should be done.
So that's why I asked the question. You know, so is this just about integration as a good, right? And then if that's the case, then how does that actually correspond with, again, the history of harms, right? And so I understand that what you're saying is that segregation, right? I'm not supporting segregation, right? But what I'm saying is that so-called integrated schools are actually more often than not majority white schools, right? I mean, and you know, the idea here is that I want you to explain to me, right, what is the corresponding harm here that this integration plan is meant to be responsive to. And I'm assuming that you're saying that that harm is segregation. And then what I want to know is, what actually does segregation mean? Is it I am a child, a black child, and I don't have enough other kinds of people around me in my school? Is that a harm? Or is it as it has been? Because when we talk about integration as policy in schools, what this has really been about is about trying to get poor black students into better performing schools. Again, the idea of integration has been, I think, an ideal and I think a very productive way of trying to accomplish that. But what I'm saying also, and this is what Dr. Brown is getting at, is that that process also produces other harms, right? And so what I'm trying to say is, like, what does this actually accomplish, right? Because we know that integration as a virtue, as a principle, even as a policy already exists. You know, we know that the reasons why it's not successful is because people can't afford to live in places where these schools are, right? We also know that the issue is that the ideal of integration, right, as an experience in school, right, to my mind, and we could talk about having access to better education for individual students and so forth, right? Although they do come with harms. But, you know, what does that actually mean to black communities, where students are being, you know, encouraged or provided with the opportunity to leave their neighborhood schools? What you have is a further depreciation of the actual, you know, student body in current black schools, right? And we know that funding is typically tied to enrollment, right? Which means that the state would then provide even fewer resources to those black schools because some of those black students are now going to a better school across town or somewhere else. And so what I'm saying is that there is an issue here that I want us to be attentive to the fact that integrationist model for schooling also produces other harms. And if I am going to endorse running the risk of those other harms, I want to actually understand what this recommendation around integration is actually responding to. What harm is it solving?
Yeah. I'll think out loud with you on this point.
Yeah, and we're talking.
So basically, your analysis is another level. You know, when I read this, I did not
Okay.
think of that,
Right.
what you're saying. And I just assume that with the additional funding to grossly underfunded schools, hyper-segregated, that principally, you know, resolve that, or not resolve the issue, but address the issue. And then to the extent that there's opportunities for kids to go to school with kids of other races, that has merit in and of itself. Not as a way of solving this problem of hyper-segregated and underfunded schools, but rather as part of the educational experience.
Right.
You know, and part of that, frankly, is we all draw from our own experience. I grew up in Oakland, and I went to Oakland High School at a time when it was very democratizing. The rich white kids had to go to school with the poor black folks and other minorities. And there was some value in that. Now, that was a moment in time. With everything else that's happened, Oakland, like everywhere else, became hyper-segregated. But Oakland High was neither a, you know, highly segregated school one race. It was amazing that period during the 60s that there was that degree of segregation, and there's merit basically in having that experience with other races, especially in the country we live in. But that said, I don't want to have the report be misunderstood that by this program, whether it's a Berkeley integration plan or something else, we're actually solving a problem and not creating more problems. So I want to consider and include what you're saying, but in the end, we need to provide guidance to the DOJ as to what the next draft is going to look like. So, I mean, one simple thing is to leave it out. Don't mention integration at all. Another way is to say the principal problem is disparate funding for schools. We need to fix that. And to the extent districts want and parents want to have voluntary education, to create an experience for their child, son or daughter, fine, but we need to have wraparound services too to make sure, to ameliorate what, the harm that Pastor Brown was talking about. I'm open to any way that the task force or you're suggesting. I'm just looking for sort of a clear instruction to the
Sure.
DOJ in the next iteration.
And I think, so I'm not saying that we should get rid of, trying to improve, racial integration, because sure, right? I think being in a diverse environment, right, we've seen leads to all kinds of exposure and opportunities for exposure and expansion of one's worldview. I understand that, and I think within the context of integration, what Dr. Brown is recommending is, I think, the appropriate remedy for thinking of, what to do in regards to integration. What this is actually trying to facilitate integration. What I'm saying is that there's no policy stopping, you know what I mean? There's no racist policies stopping, right, integration in schools, right? What there's housing policy that is prohibiting integration in schools, right? There's labor policy stopping integration in schools, right? And so what I'm saying is that actually by saying we're going to incentivize and provide funding to increase integration, right? And this is an integration which is about moving to a better performing school, right? What I'm saying is that, to my mind, actually introduces, right, harm, because again, it takes away from the enrollment in these poorer performing schools, right? Assuming that they're poorer performing schools, which I'm assuming, let's say in this case, are meant to be represented by Black poorer performing schools, right? Which also, to my mind, also tears at the fabric of these communities.
Understood.
And so I think in terms of integration, it should say, in supporting the state's, right, commitment to integration, right, there needs to be services in schools that help support the experiences of Black students who are especially in majority non-Black schools, right? And I think that's appropriate, because that to me responds to a very distinct harm, right, and is about supporting, students who are in these schools. As Attorney Newman said, Section A, is about supporting and funding, these Black and poor schools. We should maybe say more about that. We can expand that section.
Or we could eliminate the section entirely. I mean, my understanding, unless the DOJ, correct me if I'm saying this wrong, not every school district allows inter-district or
Right.
intra-district transfers. I
That's
mean,
right.
once you go to a school, that's your school.
Right.
And Berkeley's unusual in that it has a process. But what you're saying is in that process that allows students to
What I'm
opt
saying is
out,
that process is
it could
necessary.
create problems.
The process is necessary because the schools that the students are currently at aren't funded adequately.
Yes.
That's what I'm saying.
And
is
we
that-
could totally say that
Yeah,
in this report.
Yeah.
I mean, let's tell
Yeah.
the truth.
yeah,
But I guess the question as a position for the task force,
yeah.
do you want to just eliminate it? What do you think is?
What I'm saying is that I think the language of M, right?
Is
If M is to represent integration, right, and anti-segregation in schools, should be what Dr. Brown proposed, which is to say, let's provide better services for Black students who are in, right,
Okay.
who have been able to go into these other schools, because I think that we have to be mindful of the motivation, oftentimes, right? I mean, I'm gonna just speak frankly. I don't think your average Black parent is sending their kid to some other school because I really want my kid to go to school with other kinds of children. I don't think that's the primary motivation, and I'm not speaking for anybody, but I'm making an assumption. All right, the motivation is, that school has high-performing, test scores, that school has this services, has those amenities, oh, there's, I mean, that's the motivation.
Right.
And so, I think with this model, it isn't changing that. It's just facilitating, because as those black kids who leave their poor schools and go to these other schools that are already well resourced, they're actually going to become more resourced because enrollment is increasing.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think, it's if we think about this comprehensively, right? If there is housing, if there is all of these different things that actually lead to the issue of school segregation being responded to, really across this whole, our whole policy, that should in principle begin to respond to the actual core, the kind of core reasons for school segregation. What I want us to be mindful of is, again, how our recommendations might actually go and produce newer forms of injury, right? So we should fund black schools.
But should we have then a paragraph on basically it has this deleterious bad effect? that
By
you're saying?
increasing, no, what I'm saying is we should fund black schools, which is in A, right? And we should
Yes.
say more to that.
Right.
Right? Under M, I think we should adopt more of Dr. Brown's thinking, which is to say, within the context of integrated schools, where school districts, right? School districts should be encouraged to, right, open their doors to anybody who wants to come, right?
But if they do that,
But if they do that, they need to provide further
Wraparound
wraparound services,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
But the way that this
That's
reads
fine.
right now, it kind of feels like it's like
I
encouraging
totally get it.
this,
Yeah.
right? And that's, to me, that is injurious, right? And so that's
Right.
what I want us to kind of just be
So
mindful
the M has to be rewritten.
Yeah.
So we're not actually asking for a motion to change it, but rather to edit this, to basically reframe it.
And this is just my feelings. I know there's plenty other people down this end of the table, If you have other thoughts, please.
I'll be quick. I don't think I have anything new to add. My thought process was to the document should reflect the prioritization. And if we know that there is integration now that is occurring, then I think we have a responsibility to add that additional services need to be provided, wraparound services need to be provided. But I would agree that, we need to prioritize funding our black schools. I will say that San Diego doesn't really have majority black schools, so how we frame that language is even, but the intent of that, I think, is where I would want to see that prioritization in the document.
Yeah, I share my brother's concerns about the integration issue, and I think the real underlying issue is something that we've had several studies actually document this, which we're dealing with discrimination in the form of teacher quality and school finance, and that if we actually address some of these root causes, then we might see some white students wanting to come to our schools, right? When we start seeing white students and other students wanting to come to our schools, then I think we will have accomplished something. And I think it's probably better to focus our attention on making things equitable and fair and resourced, not equal, because equal just means and that's not going to cut it. I think also the issue about integration and like having our children go out to other communities. There have been some troubling studies that have shown things like what happens if you're a big fish in a little pond, which is our best and brightest students in our schools, and then having them transfer to become little fish in a big pond, which is they're now the quote-unquote minority in a majority white environment where they are subject to a host of problems around racial stress and racial discrimination and trauma. And that, in fact, our kids do better in our own schools socially and emotionally, and if they were well-resourced schools, even academically.
I don't think there needs to be any motions, right? Okay.
No.
Do you have enough guidance?
Yeah, I think we have guidance and can work with the advisory committee as well as you, Member Lewis. We can take your feedback as well and just
Yeah.
give it to, and we'll incorporate that as well into the document for the final document.
All right, any other comments? If not, we can move to the next. Oh, sorry, Member Gross, you're recognized.
I just had one, we asked around, I can't find it now, related to item D. I know it's not a new item, but I didn't quite catch this before. So the item D is improved access to educational opportunities for all incarcerated people. And I was wondering if we could expand that to include evidence-based incarceration for those still in custody. We're about to release a report for LA County that I led for my commission. And what we found is that, no surprises, Black folk are the ones least likely to get into the education-based incarceration programs across the jails.
Okay, thank you for that, Member Gross. We can move on.
Okay. Yeah, that's noted, and we'll expand on that. The next one is racism in environment and infrastructure. These proposals has been, as I mentioned, they've been shifting around, so these proposals have been included in mental and physical harm and neglect. We'll talk about it in a minute, and also a little bit of education. So we could move on then to pathologizing Black families. Dr. Grills is the member who is on the advisory committee for this. So, Dr. Grills, do you want to introduce, there's one new proposal, and do you want to otherwise talk about the proposals?
I think we can go to the one new proposal, which I don't remember which one is new. There's so many in this.
It's proposals to address disproportionate homelessness among Black Californians.
Okay. So one way that we end up pathologizing our families is connected to housing. I mean, all of these different points are all interconnected, but we realized as we were going through our recommendations that there needed to be some additional attention to the role that homelessness plays. It increases the likelihood that our children will be taken away from their parents and put in the child welfare system if they are unhoused. And then just the mere fact of being unhoused, whether one is living in one's car or in motels and motels mostly, it puts a strain on the ability of that family to be a whole and functioning family. So I don't know where on what page that additional piece comes in. Can anyone help me? 64?
64.
Okay. Yeah. Mhm. So, so the things that were added here is to streamline and incentivize the development of permanent supportive housing and extremely low housing, mandating anti-bias and other training for staff of homeless service providers because there's uneven treatment by those who are trying to access the services that are already there. And then to fund permanent supportive housing diversion programs for folks who are incarcerated in the county jails. Fund a study and analysis of county jail efforts to secure housing for incarcerated individuals upon release. Again, that's another area where things are very uneven. And if I think of the example of women, and then Black women in particular, I don't know if folks realize you could be released from CRDF jail in the middle of the night with nothing. And of course, there are folks waiting there to prey on them. So we've got to look at, and the reentry services are located over at Twin Towers downtown. the women are across town in Linwood. So, so there really needs to be some accounting and addressing of that. The fifth one was develop and launch a racial equity initiative, allocate broad-based funding to community-based organizations. There are a number of community-based organizations that are already addressing issues related to housing concerns for Black residents, for African-American residents. For example, right in Los Angeles, there's a consortium of about, I think it's 20 Black organizations who have been, who have been working on diligently issues related to homelessness, and we need to support them. And we need to support them to scale, because the other problem is that, one, our organizations don't get access to the money. If they get access to the money, they are funded at levels far below what is needed to get the job done, which is essentially setting them up for failure or setting them up for serious burnout. The seventh one was to increase compensation for homeless service providers, and that kind of goes along with what I was just saying, that the pay scales for folks who are doing this important and difficult work is not a livable wage, and we need to change that. Eighth, enact civil rights protection to guard against housing and employment discrimination, strengthen housing eligibility and tenant protections, fund and implement measures to protect homeowners. So again, understanding there's a lot of emphasis here on housing because of the direct effect of housing on the ability of a family to be whole and fully functional.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Member Grills. Any comments, questions, additions? Hearing none, we'll move forward to the next committee.
Okay, the next chapter is control over creative, cultural, and intellectual life. And member Chair Moore, you are the advisory committee for this one. And there's one new proposal, which is to erect monuments, plaques, and memorials memorializing and preserving Reconstruction era and the descendant community.
And I added that because J, initially the proposal was to identify and remove monuments that memorialize Confederate culture, but I noticed that there wasn't any recommendation that talked about, okay, once you remove them, what do you replace them with? So that is why we put in there, well, I put in there, to erect monuments, plaques, memorials that honor the brief period of Reconstruction in this country. Notably, Dr. Brown brought Professor Kidada E. Williams' book that just came out, I Saw Death Coming, A History of Terror and Survival in the War Against Reconstruction. There are several different entities like the National Museum of African American History and Culture, that are reviving this Reconstruction era history. And also similar to what I've mentioned before in terms of the denazification of Nazi Germany. So not only did Germany work to remove any lingering remnants of Nazi culture in Germany, but they also replaced those monuments and relics with monuments and relics that honored those who were victims of the Holocaust. And so, when you visit Germany, you'll see those memorials and plaques are everywhere, showing what the Holocaust victims, survivors went through, and that contributes to the culture they have today in terms of being very accepting and all of that. So yeah, that's why I put that in there. So are there any comments, questions, additions, modifications? Oh, it could be to any of them.
Okay. May I?
Sure.
Yeah.
Girls, you recognize.
Nothing about what's already there. I was just wondering if there might be, if I could pass on some information to the committee. I was able to speak with, at length, some folks in Black media. And they've been working on, they've done a report, and they have a blueprint related to Black media. And so one of the things that they are suggesting is for Black media institutions and Black media makers to have access to repair themselves from the harm caused by anti-Black narratives produced by dominant white media institutions and supported by government policies that have basically prevented Black folk from creating and controlling the distribution of their own stories. And I know that there already is in California a California journalism bill, which they actually spoke to. That bill is, it was passed last year, I think, the state legislature, and it earmarked $25 million that's currently going to go to UC Berkeley, if it hasn't already, and to their graduate school of journalism to fund fellows to work at journalism institutions. So they would go to major news organizations and work there. And it's the largest investment of funds to support the cultivation of journalists. The problem or the concern by the Black journalists is that essentially it's still going to there'll still be barriers to them accessing these resources and to the building up of the Black media itself. So I would like to just share the ideas and the studies that they themselves have done for consideration, to include them.
Thank you. That's great. So I'll definitely accept that. I will say, though, in the proposal to create the Freeman Affairs Agency within the Cultural Affairs branch, there was a proposal directed towards Black media specifically, but we're all reworking some stuff, so thank you. Any other questions? Modification? Okay, hearing none, we'll move forward.
Okay, the next chapter is stolen labor and hindered opportunity. The members here are Bradford and Montgomery Step. There are no new proposals. There's been development of the proposals that were discussed last time, so re-elevating it in case anybody had any feedback regarding what is in the 105-page concise edits or suggestions.
Yes, Member Scott Lewis, you're recognized.
Thank you for this section. I wondered if any consideration should be given to the kind of creation of some kind of like investment infrastructure, banking infrastructure, something like that. Because I think all the proposals are great in terms of trying to, improve the wage, income, etc. Businesses, and so I think what might still be needed is to say, well, who do you get your, who do you facilitate, that business with or through, and so again, if there's interest in trying to support the development of banks, etc., to kind of, what's that? Yeah. So it said there are businesses, but there's like the investment component of it. So so we can create a business, but then we're putting our profits into where, and I don't know if it's appropriate to do that or not. But that just feels like that's one part of the missing ecosystem.
I didn't come prepared to talk on that, but there has been discussion in the legislature through various means. I chaired banking a couple years ago, and that was discussed, having an African-American funding source, so to speak, institution. So
Yeah.
I'll further explore that. I know we're looking for an answer today, but I agree with you there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still in a period of feedback. So I think, but
Yeah.
so I'm like, yes, so better wages, better training,
Yeah.
more better wages, which can go into helping to produce more Black-owned businesses. But then I think it's, where do those businesses put their money?
Exactly.
Where do you put your increased wage? You know what I mean? And so I just wondered if that was part of the kind of cycle, of it. So.
It needs to be. I
Okay.
mean, we didn't do a deep dive there, but no, that's a good point. especially in light of, I don't want to call out the wrong bank, but just 2 weeks ago, which bank was it that was fined for not lending
Right.
to African Americans specifically, and their home loan program was dismal. Was it Wells?
I know Wells was doing some nonsense.
B of A. Yeah, all
You know, all of them.
yeah.
All of the above.
Yeah, true. But this is so egregious that it was really highlighted.
Yeah, I mean, especially, when something happens at the federal level, you know what I mean, the banks should be target number 1 or 2, you know what I mean? Think about the history of Citibank and some of those foundational banks and their direct investment and profiting from slavery in this country, it's terrible. So, I mean, if we could, so therefore, I'd hate for us to be incentivizing creation of black businesses and then those dollars go into Citibank, and I've said it because I don't know.
No.
But-
I mean, and that did exist. I mean,
Right.
50 years ago, and I'm pretty sure Dr. Brown could list them far better than I, but you have One United and so many other that were black institutions were
Right.
doing specifically that, so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the history is that like a century ago, there were over 120 black-owned banks
Yeah.
in the country, and now we're talking about a fraction of that today. So, I mean, if we could,
Banks and insurance companies.
yeah, exactly.
Member Holder, you're recognized.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is the
Jersey
section
City.
for it, especially since I'm a little bit
What did I just
confused
say?
because
Oh,
section
One United, so
13 on
City
105
National, that was fine, yeah.
says
Yeah.
the wealth gap
Yeah.
proposals for this chapter are addressed separately.
Yeah,
I'm not
I'll
sure what that
explain
means, but,
Yeah,
that might end up negating what I'm saying if there's going to be a separate place to address these, but I'm thinking of putting proposals that have to do with the wealth gap or creating professional pipelines to help diminish that. Right now, I'm thinking about putting that in this chapter. And so that's what my suggestion was going to speak
Yeah.
to, so.
So can I maybe, Chair Moore, I might have to just skip ahead quickly to discuss my section, which is the wealth gap. And so that's exactly right. So, thinking about banks and lending infrastructure was something that I initially wanted to put into the racial wealth gap, section. But, as of the last meeting in December, we had that conversation about what the wealth gap actually would represent. And so because in thinking about federal reparations, the wealth gap is meant to represent the total sum of harms against African Americans. And so, what economists who advocate for reparations like Solidarity are saying is that you can take the differential of wealth between white Americans and black Americans, and that's what black Americans are owed, right? And then that's reparations, right? And so, but what we've done is we've taken a different approach to coming up with recommendations where we have these 12 areas, we're developing policies around them, and in particular, we have the 5 areas that we have decided would be calculated and used to determine a kind of direct compensation-based reparations. And so therefore, what that means is that the idea of the racial wealth gap is no longer really applicable to what we're doing because the wealth gap as a form of reparations is effectively being done through those 5 atrocities. And so what Chapter 13 would look like is basically a presentation of what the economists are working on. So Chapter 13, the racial wealth gap, in principle, will be, I don't want to speak on a turn here, but what Chapter 13 would represent is effectively the recommendations around direct compensation for those 5 areas, because that is what the wealth gap means in reparations generally. So if there are like actual policies around, I think, wealth and income and so forth, like the everyday experience of wealth disparities, then I think they might be most appropriately put into this section, which is what we're discussing now.
Okay. All right, so that, with that clarification, I'll go ahead and, just make additional recommendations for this chapter. I think that we should be thinking about building professional pipelines for professions that teach people about investment and assets, and making sure that there are more Black folks in those professional spaces. So pipelines to investment banking, CPAs, tax advisors, investment advisors, just creating career training programs that encourage the building of those types of professional pipelines specifically. And also in terms of licensure, and professional development and what it takes to get a license, for instance, to be a CPA or to be in those investment and equity building career spaces, we should think about encouraging that part of that professional development be responsive to the need for building wealth in the descendant community. So doing pro bono hours or training hours that focus on building wealth in the descendant community if you want to get into those professions. So just think, just maybe thinking creatively around that type of proposal.
Any other questions for the committee on the wealth gap? We're on it.
So to confirm, Member Holder, you want that to go into the section on stolen labor and hindered opportunity. Yeah, so it's not. Yeah, so but so no. So I was explaining, that it may not be appropriate for what Member Holder was recommending to go into the wealth gap section. But
Yeah,
but I had to explain why. So which meant that I had to talk about my section, prematurely. But her recommendation was for stolen labor and hindered opportunity.
So any additional comments for this committee on stolen labor and hindered opportunity?
I just have a question. I'm not sure where this actually fits, but it's reminiscent of the excellent testimony that we heard yesterday from Johnson and from Odom related to tax consideration. So I'm wondering whether or not somewhere in among our recommendations, we might look at creating a California tax on luxury items as a way to fund reparations. Secondly, and this is coming from some of my community members, conduct an analysis of California's unclaimed rebates, probate assets, and other categories of seized assets, and redirect a portion of unclaimed assets to fund reparations efforts.
And so that's actually part of question 5, right, of our 5 questions. So I think I have a question for Michael. So those 5 questions, I think it's the 5 questions committee, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Is it? Okay.
it's the 5 questions committee continued.
Right. And
Okay.
so my question is how might that be represented, or what are the ideas for how that's represented? How that will be represented in this policy report? Like, how do we respond to the 5 questions? Is it part of the introduction or the general proposals, or?
It's a great question, and it's and there's sort of a 2-part answer.
Okay.
One of them is also, we're working through the recommendations chapter by chapter. We're still working on a recommendation as to how to organize it. We want to create a sort of a chapter that talks through all of the recommendations together. There may be reorganization, there may be a way we lay it out. So we're working through what makes sense narratively now that we're sort of all coming together with the advisory committees, and now everyone's coming together to talk through them together. So this question about collapsing potentially the wealth gap, or not necessarily having a separate wealth gap set, will, I think, be answered as we work through that final organizational question. And then the 5 questions sort of underlie all of it. The 5 questions really go to when you're talking about who's eligible for different things based on when they're in California, or when they suffer harm, or level of suffering harm, or eligibility generally, and how that undergirds some of the recommendations, we will, in probably the next meeting, have this discussion about each of the advisory committees have talked about different types of eligibility. For example, certain things may not be able to be restricted to, descendants. Certain things may not, because, for example, the death penalty, it would be difficult. I mean, it's still, the task force can recommend however they want to recommend it. If you decide to recommend the elimination of the death penalty, is that the elimination of the death penalty completely in California? Is it the elimination of the death penalty only for people in a certain group? Those are going to be some of the final things that are going to have to be addressed when we finalize these recommendations. So those tie in together, and then when you answer those 5 questions, that will influence the way all the recommendations are finally done. So you're sort of answering those questions for all of the members, which is why we want to move towards answers on those sooner rather than later.
So to clarify, so question 5 is like, how do we pay for it, right?
Yeah.
And so will each chapter then have effectively a section that represents chapter 5's question? Like, how do we pay for, stolen labor and hindered opportunity? Or is there just simply going to be, say, at the end of the policy, here's our recommendation? Because I'm basically just trying to figure out where Dr. Grill should be placing her recommendation. Because you gotta clean your phone. But if I'm trying to figure out where, because it sounds like you maybe want to make a recommendation to the stolen labor section, but that does sound like a recommendation for how to pay for, or a part of the recommendations for how to pay for it.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, the 5 questions are very specifically guiding the experts. So the sort of the wealth gap overlaps with the monetary compensation. So you're answering the 5 questions specifically to direct the experts on their calculations.
Right.
Either calculation of reparations recommendation, or their recommendation how to
Right.
calculate reparations.
Right.
We are also going to be working through DOJ, supporting task force members on eligibility for all of these different policy recommendations. And if there are different issues, like I mentioned, the death penalty or schools or things like that, that are more generally applicable. And so I think when you're talking about who's going to pay or how we're going to pay, that's really going to the money question. If you want to have a recommendation that talks about what I think Dr. Grills may be talking about is creating sort of an ongoing fund that would serve to fund all of these recommendations, policy recommendations and reparations, I think that would be, we'd have to figure out how that would fit in, but there's sort of a difference between those two, is what I'm hearing.
I mean, I think there is, but I mean, I can imagine, just for argument's sake, in the structure of this policy, that there is, questions 1 through 4, I understand are meant to be guiding the experts, but there are also questions that help to kind of contextualize what all of this is about, you know what I mean?
That's
And
right.
why we have this community eligibility, how we determine eligibility, how that eligibility would be, guaranteed or what have you. But then question 5 is like, well, how do you pay for it? And so I imagine that there could be a separate chapter, right, which is, here are our recommendations. So we had people come yesterday and tell us, well, we think you could tax this person, or you could, or I'm asking where in the policy are we meant to put that recommendation
I think
as
that
you
would-
currently see it?
That's a good, that's a good point. I think it might be its own, I mean, again, depending on the organization of the chapter on recommendations. When you're talking about concrete recommendations for how to pay for everything, partly, obviously, we'd look to the experts to give us advice on that, because a lot of them have done work on this. But there would be room for us, for the task force, to delineate a whole bunch of suggestions to the legislature as to how to fund it, not only in the first place to get the original, cash reparations, but also as an ongoing matter.
I think I'm just asking a question of format and structure of the document. So like where would what Dr. Grills is saying, which isn't just about the stolen labor issue, but the general program of paying for the reparations? Is there a plan? Because DOJ is structuring the actual document. So is there going to be a section where we have the set of policy, or not policy, the set of recommendations for how to pay for it? So is there going to be a separate section, or is it going to be?
The experts are going to make recommendations. I mean, ultimately, that's a decision for the final
Yeah.
report. So
Okay.
either we could have, I mean, I guess you're asking much more of a
I'm just asking where it's going.
organization. We don't know. I mean,
Okay.
it'll be whatever you decide. I mean, you
Okay.
guys will decide where it goes.
Because I just basically want to be able to tell Cheryl where to, you know what I mean, or whoever's taking notes, or however things are being collected. Because what I'm saying is that what you're saying, Dr. Groves, I don't think it's necessary for, for Bradford and Montgomery SEP to go away and try and think about that. That sounds like, well, when we're paying for whatever the sum is of this stuff, right? We're saying, here's how we suggest you go away and fund it. And I just, because this current policy proposal is basically a structured document from the interim report and those chapters, we
Correct.
don't yet have a section on how to pay for it. And so I'm just asking, so that way Dr. Grills knows where to.
There can be, I mean, again, this can be either its own chapter, how to pay
Okay.
for, or own section of this
Okay.
recommendations chapter, how to pay for it. There can also be a certain things, like, I don't know if there are certain sort of direct connections between, we were talking about selling off, jail,
Right.
prison facilities and what to do with it.
Right.
So integral to the different recommendations
Right.
may be how to pay for some of the
Yeah,
recommendations.
that's what I was asking. If they're gonna, what I was asking is if question 5 was gonna be built in, just like with the interim report, there were recommendations that followed each history, right, of each chapter. So here's what's happened. Here's what we recommend you do. And then what I'm asking is, would there be, say, in principle, a following section like, here's how you pay for it, right? Or is there just gonna be an overall chapter? Because if it is in each chapter, there's a section recommending how to pay for it, then it is appropriate then for Dr. Grills to give that information to members Bradford and Montgomery STEP, because they would need to maybe write that in.
So I think the concept had been, we have the interim report, and the interim report talks about all the harms that had happened, and that sort of stands on its own. And then a chapter on recommendation, there's a chapter obviously on reparations.
Okay.
From the experts that have been retained, they'll develop this recommendation for you all on actual reparations, and then we'll have a chapter that'll talk about all of these recommendations. The organization is yet to be determined whether it makes sense to tie it in with each chapter
Gotcha.
to
Okay.
something else.
So-
And in those recommendations can also be certain specific policy suggestions for the legislature to consider in terms of funds that are available for paying for all these things. Ultimately, the legislature and the Department of Finance will make their determinations on whatever the proposed legislation is, but the task force can certainly make recommendations about where money may be
Right.
influenced by these and other
Right.
experts.
Okay. So I guess, Dr. Grills, just make a note. Yeah. All right, because there may be a chapter that, I don't know where it's meant to go yet, so. All right.
Committee chapter.
Mental and physical.
The next chapter is number 11, an unjust legal system. And the members on this advisory committee are Holder and Jones Sawyer. Sorry, checking on my updates. There are no new proposals. The proposals that you see delineated here are the ones that are in the 105-page document that we discussed last time as well. I don't know if the members have any updates or information they want to share, or if any of the task force members have any questions.
Then, no, there's nothing else more that I want to share, except just so that there's no confusion. We've had some earlier recommendations that could have possibly been put here. We have no, there's no authorship. The example I'm going to give is about closing prisons, which probably should be in the unjust legal system. But where it is now is just fine. As long as we do it, that is the most important. And I don't think we care where it is, as long as we make it a priority and we get it done.
Page 85, where we talk about strengthen and expand the Racial Justice Act. I gave a presentation on that yesterday, and so those materials should be incorporated into that section, those new materials.
Great. Sure.
Okay, we're fine.
Any other comments, questions? All right, we'll go to the next chapter.
Okay. The next topic is number 12, mental and physical harm and neglect. The members for this advisory committee are Tamaki and Brown, and there are some new proposals and substantive changes in this chapter. Member Tamaki, do you want to talk about them?
I'll present the things that are new and then ask Pastor Brown, if you have anything to add, please feel free to interrupt me or jump in. So in this section, there's a number of things, and I'll just read them off. In the original proposal, we're recommending the creation of a California Health Equity and Racial Justice Fund, funded, to the extent of something over $100 million. And it would, if put into existence, issue grants to community-based organizations to implement at the ground level in the neighborhoods some of these health initiatives that we've been talking about. This would also add, and here's the change, a mechanism to assess and monitoring. It's a monitoring mechanism to determine that the distribution, implementation, and impact is effective and right and follows its mission. And so that's simply been added to the original proposal of creating the fund, and that is to put in a mechanism to monitor the money spent correctly. Second thing would be something similar. There's a number of laws implemented by the California Department of Public Health, and there should be a process to monitor the efficacy of it, and also to the extent that medical providers, for example, are not following those recommendations, that there be consequences for that. And I don't know, as we speak, what those consequences might be, but it might be loss of funding, it might be something, I guess licensure or discipline or something. And again, to ensure that what we've been talking about in terms of reforming the medical system, that there's some ability to hold providers accountable. Third thing is more pipeline issues, providing medical social workers and healthcare advocates. And as most of us know, you're lucky if you get 5 minutes with your doctor or a medical provider. And oftentimes you get an answer, or the medical provider could be dismissive or evidence bias. A recent California Healthcare Foundation study, a think tank on health policy, interviewed or took a survey of Black patients and found that there's a high degree of dissatisfaction where the feeling is the medical provider's not listening. And so the idea is to have advocates to basically help advise and navigate to the system, and to the extent that a patient experiences bias, that there's an advocate to identify and begin to fix that. The next thing is to fund research on the intergenerational direct and indirect impact of racism. And I don't know, Assemblyman Richard Pan, or is it Senator Richard Pan, had recently proposed that healthcare for Black Californians to be declared a health emergency. And there's very little, the studies on, Member Grills knows more about this, but the studies on the impact of racism and healthcare is being started, but it has to be, further explored more. And for example, psychiatrists and psychologists have noted that compared to research on structural racism and experience of racial discrimination, the intergenerational impact of racism has been less studied, and that is how that negative injury could be passed on from one generation to the next and surface as health problems. And what we're looking at a very top level is Black people die younger and are sicker. And it correlates with race. I mean, that impact. So basically, this commits the state to let's study this. Let's find out what this is about, and have that inform policy in California on healthcare. Remedying the high rates of mental health issues. This is something that Member Grills has really championed, the high level of suicide rates among young African American youth. This is next area is testing and eliminating toxicity in descendant communities. And as Pastor Brown has talked about, for example, the Bayview Hunters Point Naval Shipyard legacy from World War II, where Black people were housed in public housing and because of redlining and discrimination, not able to move out, except maybe the Fillmore, which was later destroyed beginning in the 50s. The shipyard was used to clean ships, and I think one of them, the ships, or one example is the ships that were exposed to nuclear blasts in the Pacific, just to test the impact of nuclear weaponry post-World War II, and brought back to the shipyard to be sandblasted to try to cleanse those ships. And of course, the dust from that contaminated material goes into the surrounding territory, and as a consequence, there is levels of nuclear radiation and other things. In McClymonds High School in Oakland, for example, West Oakland, there was issue of lead contamination, and I'm sure that's the case in other communities because of the legacy of housing and zoning and all that. So the need for testing, I think, is self-evident. There's a new section to address food injustice. This is another area that Pastor Brown has championed, and that is the issue of food deserts, the closure of supermarkets and Black communities, certainly support for urban farming, education on nutrition. There's a whole host of chronic diseases arising from behaviors, smoking, high sugar, leads to diabetes and heart disease. So the need for education to help address part of this problem of, as I said, Black people dying younger and ending up sicker. The one thing that I proposed actually yesterday, and by the afternoon, Meena Viswanathan had produced a memo, and that is, we're covering disparate healthcare generally, hospitals, seeing a doctor, internal medicine, and this sort of thing. But we really should also be focusing a lot on the need for oral health care, dental care. And that is linked, by proven studies to chronic diseases such as stroke, heart disease and diabetes when you don't have adequate dental care. And many of these things are, if they originate as an oral problem, dental problem, they're preventable, and yet children still suffer from dental disease due to inadequate home care and lack of access to dental care. And not surprisingly, the data in connection with those harms is disparate. In other words, again, Black people are at the bottom of that metric. And so there's going to be a section basically on what California should do on the underrepresented representation of Black dentists, the problem of access to dental care in the community, and implicit bias in dental care providers. Again, that's certainly mirrored in the current proposal as written on doctors and other healthcare providers, but it's also extended toward, in connection with dentists, of course, affordability and insurance coverage, and so on. And also education. So there'll be a whole new section on that. We don't have this, but this was produced literally within 5 or 6 hours of when I asked for it. So none of the task force members has copies of this, but it will end up in the next iteration of the proposal. Dr. Brown, do you have anything?
He had to step out for
Okay.
an emergency call on the Memphis
No
situation.
problem. That's it for me. Is there any questions?
Member Jones Sawyer, then Member Grills.
This section is really, it's really important to me. It's come home to me over the last 2 months. In December, I had a minor surgery, which was supposed to be 1 day in and out within an hour. That day, I died of a cardiac arrest. And when I asked the doctors what happened, I'm still being told they don't know. I have a feeling that whatever they gave me, injected me to bring me back out, probably wasn't really good for Black people. And when I asked again, what is it? The answer was, we don't know. And as I started talking to other physicians, they told me, when it comes to us, there are a lot of things they don't know. And our bodies, while they may basically be the same, through generations and generations of how we've been, how we eat and how we live, it's somewhat a little bit different and has to be handled. I'm perfectly fine. Nothing's wrong with my heart. It's still a mystery of why I had a cardiac arrest. But it also, in here, we need to really talk about physicians who understand Black people, or Black physicians, or people who are going to be sensitive to what happens to Black people. Because at the end of the day, there's far too many of us that are dying on operating tables all across this country. And we just accept it because we just accept what doctors tell us. And that is totally unacceptable. And so, I'll try to think of where that could go in here, and I'll do that. And then, unfortunately, so on here you have on F, remedying the higher rates of injury and death among Black birthing people. And I would imagine that would be the mothers. My daughter just lost my granddaughter at birth. And so we need to also take care of our Black babies that are dying for mysterious reasons. Our numbers are low, maybe because we're not taking care of our women when they get, or not our women, but women when they get pregnant, that they get the best medical care. And we need to do a lot more for Black babies so they can come into this world and be productive citizens. And so I know we had something about Black birthing people. I don't know if that included the actual babies themselves, that we should really look at that also, or make sure that it's incorporated in the analysis or whatever we're moving forward with.
Thank you, and I just want to say thank you for sharing what you went through, and we're glad that you're still here with us. You know,
Yeah, no kidding.
we still got a job to do. And Member Grills, I also kind of want to note, I think Birthing People was in there, I think to acknowledge trans men as well, just putting that out there. Okay, Member Grills, you recognize?
This is, I want to just see if I could add some additional pieces for consideration for what's already in the proposal, the recommendations. One of them has to do with the pipeline issue that was raised earlier. And that is, and I know that it's right now written around looking at the UC Prime Lead ABC program as a potential model. But we could also consider creating a graduate student aid program to support African American prospective graduate students entering into and completing MSWs, MFTs, and psychology programs. And the model, it could be modeled off of the program that at the federal level, the Federal Child Welfare Title IV-E approach. But here, we would actually allow graduates to work in community-based clinics and community-based organizations rather than being limited to government social service agencies. It's also possible that we could look at expanding the existing Title IV-E program to include service in community-based organizations for postgraduate placement as well. The other thing that I wanted to share is I met with the executive director of the California Black Health Network because they're at the front, at the heart of what is happening in terms of healthcare for Black folks in California. And they shared an interesting piece of information with me. It particularly stood out among the things that they thought could be some recommendations, and that's to address an algorithm that's apparently used in medicine that influences patient care and is biased against Black patients. So she's going to, the executive director, send me some more background information and language about that, and I can share it with the subcommittee.
Any other comments? Okay. We can go to the next chapter.
Unless there's any further discussion on the wealth gap, that is it. Those are all of the chapters. Does anybody, before we go, we'll need a vote to authorize DOJ to move forward based on what's been discussed today, subject to, I believe there was one motion on modifying one of the recommendations. So subject to that modification, we'll need a motion, and then as part of that motion discussion or before the motion discussion, if anybody has any broader comments, suggestions, concerns, or anything that has not been included already in any of those recommendations, it's late in the game to add sort of major recommendations, but if there's overarching questions or concerns, we'd love to know those.
Just maybe think more about what we discussed earlier about, you know, the payment recommendations and where they go. So that way, I think, as we each work on and go away and think about that aspect, we know exactly where it might go.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm gonna probably need to just touch base with you on the housing section because I do think a couple things got left out of the most updated version that we reviewed as a task force last month.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Should we entertain a motion at this time to provide the DOJ direction moving forward? Second? It has been properly moved by Vice Chair Brown. I believe I heard it was properly seconded by Member Monica Montgomery Stepp. I heard her first. That we allow the DOJ to move forward with the corrections corresponding to any of the chapters of the report where that is applicable. Parliamentarian?
Okay. I will take the roll.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I will take the roll, starting with Chair Moore.
Aye.
Chair Moore votes aye. Vice Chair, Brown? Aye. Vice Chair Brown votes aye. Member Bradford? Member Bradford votes aye. Member Grills? Member Grills votes aye. Member Holder? Member Holder votes aye. Member Jones Sawyer? Member Jones Sawyer votes aye. Member Lewis? Member Lewis votes aye. Member Montgomery Stepp? Member Montgomery Stepp votes aye. And Member Tamaki? Member Tamaki votes aye. Madam Chair, 9 members were present and voting. There were 9 ayes, 0 nays.
Thank you, Parliamentarian Johnson. There are 9 ayes, 0 nays, and so the ayes have it and the motion carries. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is item number 23, a break. So it's 3:41 right now. The break is scheduled for 3:45 to 4 p.m. Then we'll resume at 4 p.m. And remember, we have a hard cutoff at 5 p.m. Hello? Okay. All right, so let's move towards item number 24, next meeting agenda, task force members. Okay. So essentially, the next meeting agenda that the California DOJ has helped us draft is essentially the same as this meeting agenda, but there's just, instead of a panel on tax law, there's a panel on implementation. And then also we'll continue to hear from local municipal reparations efforts, City of Richmond and City of Palm Springs. Other than that, we'll continue to have these iterations of these advisory committee report backs for purposes of the final report. We can, entertain a motion to accept the agenda as it is, and we can just move forward. Also, I wanted to bring up, I know. Okay, so the next meeting is in Sacramento. I did hear from the community that folks we haven't gone to Inland Empire. Is it too late to change it up a little bit? Or we're just sticking with Sacramento?
I will note that according to the previous vote, the meeting was supposed to be in Sacramento for this next meeting, and then you had voted to have a final in-person meeting in Central California. It's not necessarily the Inland Empire, for the sort of final report release close to Allensworth. I think that was the motion. We'll look back on that, but that had been the original proposal. It's not Inland Empire, but it's, inland.
We're just putting that out there, putting that on the table, just hearing the community feedback. So, okay, we'll continue to be in Sacramento, and then we'll just figure it out from there. All right, so any motions Motion to accept the agenda?
Can I add just one thing? I'm
Member
sorry.
Tamaki, yeah.
It would help if we get dates earlier than better. Everybody is, and the task force, the DOJ staff, I'm sure, is extremely busy. And so the idea of filling out the doodle polls and getting some dates, March, April, May, June, would be great in terms of availability, because it's very hard with our scheduling, not knowing when the dates are going to be, so. Does that make sense?
Actually, this is a good point that you make. The dates for the next meeting, the task force voted for the next meeting to be on the 27th, 28th in Sacramento. You can re-vote on the dates and the location if you wish to.
No, not the next one, but March, April, May, June. Will they be either in person or
Yeah, that's true. You also
virtual
voted.
events? And the more we can get those dates up, the better I think it is for everybody.
Well, I think we've rerun the doodle poll. I think we were asked, to the chair's point, about scheduling the days of the week. So we have a quorum on the 27th, 28th. We reran the doodle, that was what was voted on the last meeting. We reran the doodle poll pursuant to the task force's request, and we do have a quorum also on March 3rd and 4th, which is Friday, Saturday. So you would need to vote on which dates you're going to set it on. And then we have done some preliminary work on Sacramento, but if you want to relocate the meeting, that's completely within your rights. And you have also previously voted to do virtual meetings after this. You can revisit that as well, based on your votes. So we're prepared for anything you want to vote on.
I appreciate the flexibility. My point is even whether it's going to be in person or virtual for March, April, May, June to the end, it'd be great to get some dates so we can respect that and keep it available.
You gotta turn your mic on.
Okay. I believe we did run the last doodle poll through April dates, so we will have at least the availability through April. We can go ahead and run the rest of the calendar cycle so that as far out as the final meeting, you'll have that information sooner
That'd be
than
great.
later.
Just on that note, actually to the doodle poll, we did not get a quorum of members responding to the doodle poll. So I'll just remind you, you all have the doodle poll. We'll send it again. I know you want it sooner rather than later, and maybe we can follow up with members individually, especially if we need to work out dates. But we only got responses from 5 members. So we'll need responses from everybody in order to set those dates, but we concur, we'd like those dates to be set in advance so we can coordinate everything on our end as well.
And then Member Montgomery Stepp.
Yeah, this is more on the substantive end for the next meeting. I think we had talked about discussing a letter to the federal government and to Congress about our recommendations to them for changes that need to be made, or at least something that our electeds to Congress can put forward to them as recommendations. We talked about things like qualified immunity, amending that doctrine. And so I do think that we have to have a time to discuss that process, how we want to message up to the top, so to speak, and substantively what we would like in that advocacy effort. So maybe the next meeting might be a time for that.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, we're just working out on our end what motions were made about the agenda. So certainly if you want to do a motion or to add, or if you want to add to the agenda that we'll have that conversation, we can work with you to prep that conversation. If we want to have witnesses come in as well, we can coordinate for that. There was, what I was asking Doretha about was the discussion about having legislative staffers come in and present in the next meeting on the sort of legislation side of things. And I remember there was a discussion, and
It was not part of Dr. Brown's motion, but you can.
ended up not part of Dr. Brown's motion. I just wanted to re-raise that in case somebody wanted to make a motion to also add that to the agenda next time. And then, as Chair Moore mentioned, we'll be prepared to come back again and then also have a presentation on, I think, the subpoena advisory committee. It's going to be a longer presentation in the next meeting.
Member Montgomery Stepp.
Could you please speak into the mic?
For the implementation plans, I'm confused as to why we would need another motion for that. There's space in the proposed agenda. Would it be specifically to have legislative staffers come? Or what? I'm confused, sorry.
I think that's the question to you all. How do you want that to proceed?
Okay. The other question I had was this agenda does not have a date, and I know that there was a doodle poll that went out with alternative dates to February 27, 28. Is that accurate or no?
March 3rd and 4th.
That's correct. So the
Okay.
original dates that were set at the last meeting by vote was February 27, 28th. We reran the doodle poll in response to the request for other meeting times, and the other potential, what's the word I'm thinking about? Quorum, the other quorum was March 3rd and 4th.
Okay, so we have to decide that as a part of this motion?
Correct, deciding
Okay.
those dates and deciding, I guess if you want to try to change the location. But
Okay. We'll vote probably not change the location for me. But to that point, would that March, if we decided to go the Friday, Saturday, the first Friday and Saturday of March, how would that impact the schedule for the rest of the meetings?
it's a great question. We will, I guess that March 3rd and 4th meeting would be considered the February meeting. We'll assess based on how you vote when the timing we can come back after getting all of your feedback, come back with a report again, because I think that's a major driver of what would be in the March meeting. If we consider a March 3-4 meeting, the February meeting, we'll have to really figure out this timing to do a March meeting, or whether that means we shift over, don't have a February meeting, we have that March meeting and an early April meeting as well. We'll have to report back depending on how you vote.
Okay. I will leave the discussion or proposals for implementation plans. I think that was, Member Holder, Member Tamaki, I think, had more input on that the last time. I think it's very important, but I haven't thought out what that means from a state perspective, like who would be the best folks to come and talk to us. So I will leave that discussion to state folks and also those who raised it the last time. Otherwise, I'm okay with the agenda as is. I would prefer the Friday, Saturday dates in Sacramento. I will wait to do a motion.
Okay, Member Holder, or Member Tamaki, I think it was Member Holder, did you kind of want to just summarize kind of the idea around the implementation panel briefly, and like the types of people we might be looking to invite?
Well, yeah, this was a motion that I guess we made at the January meeting, or the December meeting, rather. something very similar to the tax advisors who came and spoke to us, who were talking about, you know, looking at potential means of implementing some of these policies that we have proposed, and looking at the feasibility of implementing them on a broad scale. And folks who actually have experience implementing these types of programs on a very broad scale, perhaps nationally or in other states, and who we can have the benefit of their experience, what it looked like to try and implement this and how feasible it was to do it. To just give us more of a practical perspective on what implementation would look like. I think I did actually send some specific suggestions to the DOJ, and I think everyone is open to do that on implementation experts.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, so it seems like there's a motion that could be considered to approve the agenda as is for March 3rd and 4th, Friday, Saturday in Sacramento.
A briefing from legislators, you're talking about legislative analysts on future policies, or legislators themselves?
Or is that I think what I was referring to is there was discussion during that discussion about having legislative staff talk about
But I
the
mean,
legislative
okay,
process.
but you say legislative staff, that of a member or the legislative analyst's office?
I don't have an opinion. I mean,
I would suggest it would be the legislative analyst's office to give a broader overview of how implementation works. And just seeing that you're considering a Friday, Saturday, Friday would probably be your only day to schedule that. It would be probably better a Thursday, Friday versus a Friday, Saturday. So.
Obviously, when this is all finalized, and this is sort of more broadly, they would count as a witness, and we would I'll come up with a witness date once you vote on the date of the meeting, but we'd love any recommendations you'd have about that.
Yeah, okay. There also have been some, just putting it out there, some administrative law professors, so professors at law schools that specialize in administrative law that have, for instance, expressed enthusiasm in what this potential Freedmen Affairs agency could look like. And so we can also kind of explore what that looks like in terms of inviting some of these administrative law professors. All right, so do we have a motion on the floor? Yes. You can do it.
So I move that we adopt this agenda as is with dates of March 3rd and 4th, and the meeting to be held in Sacramento.
Is there a second? It has been properly moved by Member Montgomery Steppe and properly seconded by Member Jones Sawyer that our next hearing will take place Friday and Saturday, March 3rd and 4th in Sacramento, and the agenda as presented is perfectly fine. Any discussion on the matter? Hearing no further discussion, we'll turn to Parliamentarian Johnson for a roll call vote.
Thank you. I will begin with Chair Moore.
Aye.
Chair Moore votes aye. Vice Chair Brown? Aye. Vice Chair Brown votes aye. Member Bradford?
Aye.
Member Bradford votes aye. Member Grills?
Aye.
Member Grills votes aye. Member Holder? Aye. Member Holder votes aye. Member Jones Sawyer? Aye. Member Jones Sawyer votes aye. Member Lewis? Aye. Member Lewis votes aye. Member Montgomery Steppe?
Aye.
Member Montgomery Steppe votes aye. Member Tamaki? Aye. Member Tamaki votes aye. Madam Chair, there were nine members present and voting. There were 9 ayes and 0 nays.
Thank you, Parliamentarian Johnson. There are 9 ayes, 0 nays, 0 abstentions, and so the ayes have it, and the motion carries. Our next hearing will take our 13th hearing, 5th in-person hearing, will take place Friday and Saturday, March 3rd and 4th, in Sacramento. Yay. The next item on the agenda is item number 24, discussion and potential action item, unfinished business.
Yes, so with that change of the date, we need expert recommendations by, coincidentally, February 8th, which is when you're also supposed to give us any edits that you have or feedback on the recommendations. So by February 8th, we're looking for recommendations on legislative implementation, federal suggestions, and local reparations efforts. So please, sooner the better, but please send those no later than the 8th. And then we have one quorum date in early April. If we keep a month interval between those two, and that's April 7th and 8th. That is also a Friday and Saturday. If we want to do something, it is, however, Good Friday and Easter. Easter is Sunday the 9th. So I'm not sure if that is a time people want to do that, but that's according to the doodle poll. So what we can do is we can then, if people want, we can rerun the doodle poll in light of this March 3rd and 4th. And we can try to ascertain your availability. If you'd prefer to just email me directly instead of the doodle poll, if that's going to be a better response, just go ahead and do that if that's easier for you, and we'll figure that out. But for now, we're going to look probably to late March and early April and try to do 1-month intervals or 5-week intervals to finalize the report.
Is not good,
Early, late March, early April. We'll follow up with those dates. Okay.
Okay, so the next item on the agenda is number 25, task force member closing remarks and meeting adjourned. Yes, Member Montgomery Stepp, you are recognized.
Chair, I just want to thank my staff members for helping with this, to put this together. They really have been all hands on deck. So we hope you all had a warm welcome to San Diego. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, City of San Diego, Member Montgomery Stepp and her staff. The meeting is officially adjourned.